There is a kind of silence that settles over a place long before anyone notices it. It does not arrive suddenly. It does not announce itself. Instead, it drifts in slowly, like a thin layer of dust resting on a wooden table, like the dimming of light at the end of a quiet afternoon. And over time, that silence begins to shape the way people live. If you were to walk through a small town in the early morning many years ago, you might not notice anything unusual at first. The sky would be pale and soft, a faint gray-blue stretching over low rooftops. Chimneys would release thin streams of smoke, rising gently into the cool air. There would be the distant sound of a door opening, a bucket being set down, footsteps on packed earth. Nothing loud, nothing hurried, just the steady beginning of another day. Inside the homes, people would already be awake, not because they wanted to be, but because they had learned to be. A mother might stand near a small wooden table, her hands moving slowly as she prepares a simple breakfast. Bread, perhaps, maybe something warm if there is time. Her movements are careful, measured, quiet, not out of peace, but out of habit. In the next room, a child sits on the edge of a bed, still, silent, eyes open but not fully awake. The child does not call out, does not stretch loudly, does not run to the window. Instead, the child waits, because somewhere along the way, the child has learned that mornings are not a time for joy. They are a time for readiness. Outside, the ground is cool beneath worn shoes. The air carries the faint smell of damp soil and wood smoke. A man steps out of the house, closing the door gently behind him. Not softly in a comforting way, but softly in a careful way, as if sound itself must be controlled. He pauses for a moment, looking out at the road. There is no rush in his movement, but there is no freedom in it either. Only routine, only expectation. And this is how it begins. Not with rules written on paper, not with loud commands or visible force, but with small, repeated actions, a quiet shaping of behavior, a slow teaching of obedience. Day after day, morning after morning, until it no longer feels like something learned. It simply feels like the way things are. In homes like these, across towns and villages, life followed a pattern so steady that it almost disappeared into the background. Children grew up within this pattern. They watched it, they absorbed it, and without anyone needing to explain it in words, they began to understand what was expected of them. They learned how to sit, how to speak, how to remain still, even how to think in ways that did not cause trouble. Joy, when it appeared, was small, quiet, careful, a brief smile while walking alone, a soft laugh that ended quickly. Because too much joy, too much expression could draw attention, and attention was not always welcome. So joy became something private, something hidden, something that slowly faded. Schools, when children entered them, did not feel entirely different from home. The buildings were often simple, wooden desks arranged in straight lines, windows that let in a pale, steady light, walls that held little decoration. Everything had its place, and everything stayed in its place. The teacher stood at the front of the room, not harsh, not loud, but firm in a quiet, unchanging way. Lessons were given slowly, repeated often. Not just lessons of reading or numbers, but lessons of behavior. Sit straight, hands still, eyes forward, wait for your turn. Do not interrupt.
Do not question unless asked. And over time, these instructions became something deeper. They became a rhythm, a way of being. Children learned to listen before they spoke, to pause before they moved, to consider not what they felt, but what was expected. Outside the school, the world continued its steady pace. Fields stretched out beyond the edges of town. Roads wound slowly between houses. The seasons changed, as they always had. But even here, in the open air, there was a sense of quiet order. Work needed to be done. Tasks needed to be completed. There was little space for wandering thought, little space for unstructured time. Even play, when it happened, often followed simple, repetitive patterns, running in circles, tossing small stones, simple games with simple rules. And even then, voices stayed low, laughter stayed contained, because the habit of obedience does not disappear easily. It follows, it lingers, it settles into the body like a second nature. In the evenings, as the light began to fade, families gathered once more inside their homes. Candles, small lamps would be lit. The glow was soft, flickering gently against the walls. There might be quiet conversation, short sentences, simple observations about the day. No long stories, no loud expressions, just enough words to pass the time. Children listened more than they spoke, and when they did speak, they chose their words carefully, not out of fear exactly, but out of practice, a long-practiced awareness of boundaries. Over many years, this way of living shaped an entire generation, not suddenly, not forcefully, but slowly, gently, almost invisibly. They became people who knew how to follow, who understood structure, who moved through life with a steady, careful rhythm. But somewhere beneath that rhythm, something quieter remained. A softness, a curiosity, a small, distant echo of something lighter, something that once had been more natural, more free, but now felt unfamiliar, like a memory that could not quite be reached. And so the days continued, one after another. Mornings that began in stillness, afternoons filled with quiet work, evenings that settled into soft silence. A life shaped not by sudden events, but by repetition, by gentle correction, by the slow and steady teaching of obedience. Until, in time, it no longer needed to be taught at all. The night would come, the air cooling once more, the sounds of the day fading into the distance, and inside those quiet homes people would rest, not with excitement for what tomorrow might bring, but with a quiet acceptance that tomorrow would be much the same. And in that sameness, there was a kind of calm, a steady, unchanging calm, the kind that settles over everything and stays.
Morning returned in the same quiet way it always did. Not suddenly, not brightly, but as a slow, soft light that pressed gently against the edges of the world. Inside the small homes, the air still carried the faint coolness of the night. Wooden floors held on to that chill, and bare feet moved across them without sound. There was no rushing, only the steady beginning of another familiar day. A child, now more awake than before, sat at the table, hands folded, back straight. Not because anyone had reminded them, but because they no longer needed reminding. The body had learned, the mind had adjusted, and somewhere, very quietly, the habit had settled into place. Across the room, a clock ticked. each second passing with a soft, even rhythm. Tick, pause, tick. It was not loud, but it was constant, and over time, that constant sound became something more than just a measure of time. It became a kind of guide, a reminder that everything had its place, everything had its moment, and nothing should move too far beyond it. As the morning moved forward, people stepped outside once again. The road looked the same, the sky only slightly brighter. A thin layer of mist might still linger over the ground, slowly lifting as the day warmed. Neighbors passed one another with small nods, no long greetings, no unnecessary words, just a quiet acknowledgement, and then onward. There was comfort in this, a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew the rhythm. For children, the walk to school was often one of the few moments that felt slightly different from the rest of the day. Not freer, exactly, but softer, less observed. Feet moved along narrow paths, sometimes brushing against grass still wet with dew. There might be a bird call in the distance, or the sound of wind moving gently through trees. And in these small moments, the world felt a little wider, a little less structured. But even here, the habit of quiet remained. Children walked side by side, but spoke in low voices. If they laughed, it was brief, contained, as if even joy had learned to stay within certain lines. Inside the classroom, the air felt still. Desks arranged neatly, chairs placed with care, everything prepared before anyone arrived. The teacher entered with the same calm presence as always, not harsh, not warm, just steady. Lessons began without announcement. A book opened, a voice speaking slowly, clearly, words repeated, phrases practiced, again and again. Not in a way that invited curiosity, but in a way that built certainty. The goal was not discovery. The goal was understanding what was already known, and, more importantly, understanding how to follow. Children listened. They copied. They sat without moving for long stretches of time. At first, this stillness required effort. Small muscles would shift. Fingers might tap lightly against the desk. Eyes might wander toward the window. But over time, even these small movements faded. Stillness became easier, natural, almost unnoticed. Outside, the day continued to unfold, the sun rising slowly, casting soft light across fields and rooftops. Work carried on in quiet, repetitive motions, hands moving with familiarity, tools used without hesitation. There was a kind of calm in this repetition, a steady rhythm that did not change. But within that rhythm, there was little room for anything unexpected, and so people learned not to expect. By midday, the world felt settled, not busy, not energetic, just steady. A meal might be taken in silence or near silence, simple food, prepared the same way it had been prepared many times before. There was no need for variety, no need for surprise. The purpose was nourishment, and once that purpose was met, the day continued as it always did. For the children, the afternoon lessons often felt longer. The light from the windows shifted slowly, shadows stretching across the floor. Time moved, but gently, almost unnoticed. And with each passing hour, the pattern of the day pressed a little deeper into their understanding. This is how things are. This is how things should be. Not as a rule spoken out loud,
but as a quiet truth that settled into place. In small ways, the idea of obedience became something more than behavior. It became comfort, predictability, a sense that as long as one stayed within the lines, everything would remain calm. There would be no disruption, no uncertainty. And for many, that calm was enough. As the school day ended, children stepped back outside, the air now warmer, the light softer, the path home familiar. Feet moved without thinking, turning corners at the right moment, crossing the same ground as always. There was no need to decide where to go. The path had already been chosen long ago. At home, the evening tasks waited. Small chores, simple duties, each one known, each one expected. There was no need for instruction, only completion. And when those tasks were completed, there might be a short moment of rest, a quiet sitting, a pause. But even rest had a certain shape, a certain limit. It was not a time for wild thought or deep expression. It was simply a space between one task and the next. As night slowly returned, the world softened once more, the sky darkening, the sounds fading, the same gentle silence settling over everything again. And within that silence, people prepared for sleep, not with excitement for tomorrow, but with quiet acceptance, because tomorrow would follow the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same steady flow. And so, day by day, without force, without resistance, a generation continued to grow, learning not through loud instruction, but through repetition, through stillness, through the quiet shaping of everyday life, until obedience was no longer something they practiced, but something they carried, softly, deeply, without even realizing it.
The days did not change quickly. They did not turn in sharp corners or sudden shifts. Instead, they moved in slow circles, returning again and again to the same quiet patterns. Morning came as it always did, a pale light resting softly against the edges of the room, the faint sound of movement in another space, the low creak of wood, familiar and unremarkable. By now, the child no longer lingered in bed. There was no waiting to be called, no hesitation. Feet touched the floor at the same moment each day, as if guided by something deeper than memory. The body knew, and that knowing felt natural. In the kitchen, the routine unfolded with the same careful rhythm. Hands moved with purpose, but without urgency. A cup placed here, a plate set there, bread cut into even pieces. No one spoke at first. There was no need. Silence had become a shared language, not empty, but full of understanding. Each person aware of the space they occupied, each movement measured, respectful of that space. Even small sounds, the brushing of fabric, the placing of a spoon, were softened, controlled. It was not that noise was forbidden, it was simply avoided. Outside, the world waited in its usual stillness. The road stretched forward, unchanged, the same small stones beneath each step, the same distant shapes of trees and fences. Everything remained where it had always been, and in that sameness there was a quiet reassurance. Nothing unexpected, nothing uncertain, just the steady unfolding of another ordinary day. As children walked toward school, they did not look around as much as they once might have. At an earlier time, perhaps they would have paused, watched a bird take flight, followed the slow movement of clouds. But now their gaze stayed forward, not forced,
but practiced. There was an understanding, soft but firm, that attention belonged to what lay ahead, not to what drifted or wandered. Inside the classroom, the air felt slightly warmer than before, bodies filling the space, breath shared quietly. Still, everything remained orderly. Desks aligned, books stacked, the teacher present, as always, at the front. Lessons began, not with excitement, not with variation, but with repetition. Words spoken clearly, then spoken again, written carefully, then written again. Each action reinforcing the last, each moment building upon what had already been learned. There was a certain comfort in this repetition, a feeling that nothing would be asked that had not already been explained, nothing would be required that could not be practiced. And so children leaned into this pattern. They followed it, trusted it, even when it felt heavy, even when it left little space for something more. Because beneath the calm surface of these days, there was something else. Not loud, not urgent, but present. A quiet weight, the weight of expectation. It did not come in the form of strict commands. No one stood above them, constantly reminding them what to do. Instead, it lived in smaller things, in the way a glance lingered when someone moved too quickly, in the slight pause when a voice rose a little too high, in the subtle shift of attention when someone stepped outside the pattern. These moments were gentle, but they were noticed, and over time they taught a simple lesson. Stay within the line, stay within the rhythm, and everything will remain calm. For many children, this lesson settled deeply. They began to anticipate it, to adjust themselves before anything needed to be said. A hand that might have lifted stayed still. A thought that might have been spoken remained quiet. Not out of fear alone, but out of understanding, a quiet agreement between the individual and the world around them. Outside the classroom, the same patterns continued. Work was steady. Movements were practiced. There was little room for hesitation, little space for wandering. Each task had its method. Each method had its place. And deviation, though not harshly punished, felt uncomfortable, out of place, like a note played slightly off-key in a long, quiet melody. As the afternoon stretched on, the light began to soften. Shadows grew longer. The edges of things became less sharp. And with this change in light came a slight easing in the air. Not a release exactly, but a softening, a gentle slowing. Children returning home carried with them the quiet lessons of the day, not just the words from books, but the deeper lessons of behavior, of stillness, of awareness. They moved through the familiar paths with a kind of quiet certainty, each step placed without thought, each turn taken without question. At home, the same expectations waited, not spoken, not enforced with strictness, but present, always present. A task left undone would be noticed, a movement too loud would be felt. And so children moved carefully, not anxiously, but attentively, as if each action carried a small, invisible weight. Evenings unfolded slowly, the light fading into soft darkness, the air cooling once again. Inside, the glow of a lamp or candle created small circles of warmth. Within those circles, people sat, sometimes together, sometimes apart, but always within the same quiet understanding. There were moments, though, very small ones, when something different appeared. A child might look toward the window a little longer than usual, watching the last light disappear beyond the horizon, or tracing the faint outline of a cloud as it slowly faded into night. In those moments, there was a softness, a brief opening, a sense of something wider than the room, something less defined, less structured. But those moments did not last long. They passed quietly, like a breath that is taken and then released. And soon the familiar rhythm returned, the quiet sitting, the careful movement, the steady presence of expectation. Over time, this expectation became something internal, no longer something felt from the outside, but something carried within, a quiet voice that guided behavior, that shaped decisions, that reminded, gently but constantly, where the boundaries lay. And so the generation continued to grow, not in sudden leaps, not in bold expressions, but in small, steady steps, each day reinforcing the last, each moment building upon what had already been learned. The night came again, soft and still, the world settling into silence, and within that silence, the weight of expectation rested gently over everything, not heavy enough to break, but constant enough to shape. And as sleep slowly took hold, and the thoughts of the day faded into quiet darkness, the pattern remained, unbroken, unquestioned, steady as ever.
Morning returned once more, as it always did, not with brightness or urgency, but with a slow, pale light that gently filled the room. By now, the rhythm of waking had become so familiar that it no longer felt like an action. It simply happened. Eyes opened at the same time. Bodies rose in the same careful way. Hands moved through the same small routines. There was no need to think about it. The day had already been shaped. The air inside the home felt still, almost unchanged from the night before. A faint coolness lingered. The wooden walls held the quiet of yesterday, as if nothing had truly passed. Even the sounds were the same, a soft step, a quiet breath, the light touch of objects being moved from one place to another. Everything continued, gently. The child, now older than before, moved with more certainty. There was less hesitation, less wandering of attention, not because curiosity had disappeared completely, but because it had learned where it could exist, in smaller spaces, in quieter moments, in ways that did not disrupt the flow of the day. Breakfast came and went without much notice. Food was eaten slowly, without distraction, without conversation beyond what was necessary. Each bite taken with a kind of calm awareness, not for enjoyment alone, but as part of the steady rhythm that carried everything forward. Outside, the morning air felt slightly warmer than the days before. The seasons, though slow, were beginning to shift. There was a softness in the breeze, a subtle change in the way light touched the ground. But even these changes were gentle. They did not disrupt the pattern. They simply moved within it. The walk to school had become almost automatic. Feet followed the same path without thought. The body remembered every turn, every small rise in the ground, every place where the earth felt slightly different beneath the step. And as the child walked, there was less looking around, less noticing of the world beyond the path, not because it was no longer there, but because attention had been trained to narrow, to focus, to remain within certain bounds. Inside the classroom, the space felt even more familiar than before. Each desk, each chair, each small detail, everything known, everything expected. And within that familiarity, there was a quiet kind of ease, but also a quiet limitation. Lessons continued as they always had, words repeated, ideas reinforced, movements practiced. But now,
Something deeper was taking place, something that could not be seen directly. The children were no longer just learning what to do. They were learning what not to do. They learned which thoughts to keep inside, which questions were better left unspoken, which feelings could be shown, and which ones should remain quiet. These lessons were never written on a board. They were never spoken in full sentences, but they were present in every pause, every glance, every small moment when the room shifted ever so slightly. If a child spoke out of turn, there was no loud correction, only a look, a brief stillness, a subtle change in the air, and that was enough, more than enough, because the goal was not punishment, the goal was understanding, a quiet understanding that certain things did not belong. Over time, this understanding settled deep within, so deep that it no longer felt like something external. It became part of the child's own thinking, a filter, a guide, a gentle boundary that shaped every action before it even began. Outside the classroom, the world continued in its steady way. Work carried on, tasks repeated, the same motions again and again. There was comfort in this repetition, a sense that nothing unexpected would appear, nothing would break the calm. But within that calm, there was also a quiet narrowing, a slow closing of certain spaces, spaces where imagination might have once moved freely, spaces where questions might have grown. Now those spaces felt smaller, more distant. As the afternoon light softened, the children prepared to leave. Books closed, chairs returned to their place, everything left exactly as it had been found. No trace of disruption, no sign of anything out of order. The walk home felt quieter than before, not because the world had changed, but because the child had. There was less impulse to speak, less need to share thoughts aloud. Words felt heavier now, more considered, more carefully chosen. Inside home, the same gentle expectations remained. Tasks were completed without being asked. Movements were controlled. Voices stayed low. Everything flowed in the same steady rhythm. Even moments of rest had a certain stillness to them. A child might sit by the window, hands resting quietly, eyes looking outward, but the mind did not wander far. It stayed close, within familiar boundaries. Sometimes a thought would begin to form, something different, something curious, a question without a clear place. But almost as quickly as it appeared, it would soften, fade, settle back into silence. Not pushed away harshly, but gently set aside. Evenings arrived in their usual quiet way, the light dimming, the air cooling, the world outside becoming still once more. Inside, the small glow of a lamp created a soft and steady warmth. There was comfort here, a deep, familiar comfort, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what to expect, exactly how things will unfold. But alongside that comfort, there was something else, something quieter, harder to notice, a certain absence, not loud enough to disturb, not strong enough to demand attention, but present in the spaces between words, in the moments of stillness, in the quiet pause before sleep. It was the absence of something that had slowly, gently faded, something that once was more natural, more immediate, more free. And yet, because it had faded so slowly, so carefully, it was not missed in a sharp way. It was simply gone, or nearly gone, like a sound that had become too distant to hear. Night settled in once again, the same calm, the same steady silence, and within that silence the lessons of the day rested quietly, unspoken, unquestioned, deeply held. And as sleep came gently, carrying everything into stillness, the pattern remained, soft, steady, unbroken.
The morning arrived again without effort. Light slipped slowly across the floor, touching the same corners, the same worn edges of wood. Nothing had moved during the night. Nothing had changed. And yet, something always was. The child, now growing steadily older, rose from bed with a motion so familiar it felt almost like breathing. There was no pause, no stretching toward the day, only the quiet beginning of what had already been decided. The home held its usual stillness, a chair placed neatly beneath a table, a folded cloth resting where it had been left, the faint smell of last night's fire now cooled to memory. Every object seemed to understand its place, and in a quiet way, so did the people. Breakfast passed with the same calm order, small movements, measured actions, the sound of a cup being lifted, the soft scrape of a chair against the floor. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Even hunger felt controlled, shaped into something patient and quiet. Outside, the air carried a gentle warmth now. The seasons were moving forward, though slowly. There was a softness in the breeze, a faint hum of life returning to the world. But even this gentle change did not disturb the rhythm. It simply folded into it. As the child stepped onto the path toward school, there was a brief moment, very small, when the light caught something different. A patch of grass brighter than before, a sound of distant movement in the trees. For just a second, attention lingered, but only for a second, because the path was waiting, and the path was certain. Walking had become something almost silent, not just in sound, but in thought. There was less wondering now, less drifting of the mind. The steps themselves seemed to guide everything else, forward, steady, without question. Inside the classroom, time felt even more still than before. The room held its quiet shape, desks aligned, books opened, the same soft light entering through the windows. The teacher spoke. The children listened. Everything unfolded exactly as expected. But now something had settled deeper, something more lasting. The children were no longer simply following instructions. They were becoming the kind of people who did not need instructions. Their movements were already shaped, their thoughts already guided, their behavior already aligned with what was expected. There was no struggle in it, no visible resistance, only a smooth, quiet flow from one moment to the next. If a new task was given, it was approached carefully, not with excitement, not with hesitation, but with a calm readiness, a quiet understanding that the task would be completed and completed properly. Even mistakes, when they happened, were handled in a soft and measured way. There was no loud correction, no sharp words, only a small pause, a gentle redirection, and then a return to the pattern. Over time, this created something very steady, a way of living that felt stable, predictable, safe. But within that safety, there was also a kind of stillness that reached beyond the body. It touched the mind, the imagination, the quiet inner world where thoughts begin. That inner world had not disappeared. It was still there, but it had grown quieter, more contained, less likely to reach outward. A child might still imagine something, briefly, a different path, a different way,
a question without a clear answer. But those thoughts did not stay long. They passed like soft clouds across the sky, seen and then gone. Because there was no space for them to settle, no place for them to grow. The structure of the day did not allow it, and over time the mind adjusted. It learned to rest within what was known, what was certain. As the afternoon arrived, the light shifted gently across the room. The edges of the desks softened, shadows lengthened. Everything felt slower, quieter. Lessons came to an end in the same careful way they had begun. Books closed, chairs moved back into place. No sudden movement, no release of energy. Just a quiet transition from one part of the day to the next. The walk home felt almost identical to the walk to school. The same path, the same steps, the same steady pace. And yet something about the return carried a different feeling, a quiet completion, a sense that the expected had been fulfilled, that the day had followed its proper course. At home, the rhythm continued without interruption. Tasks were completed, small responsibilities handled with care. There was no need for reminders. Everything was already understood. Even rest had become structured. A child might sit for a short while, hands folded, eyes calm, not restless, not searching, just still. There were fewer moments now when attention drifted toward something unknown, fewer instances of wondering what lay beyond the edges of the day. The boundaries had become clear, and within those boundaries, everything made sense. As the afternoon approached, the air cooled again. The soft glow of light returned to the room, and with it came the familiar quiet. There was comfort in this quiet. A deep, steady comfort, the kind that wraps gently around each moment, the kind that asks nothing more. But somewhere beneath that comfort, there remained a faint trace of something else, something not fully gone, not fully present, a softness that did not quite belong to the pattern, a quiet echo of something lighter, something that once moved more freely. It appeared only in brief moments, a glance that lingered, a thought that paused, a feeling that did not fully settle. But those moments were small, and they passed quickly, like a breath that comes and goes. Night once again returned, the world settling into its familiar stillness, the same quiet sounds fading into silence. And as the child lay down to rest, there was no question of what tomorrow would bring, no sense of uncertainty, no need to imagine. Tomorrow would arrive just as today had, softly, steadily, without change. And in that knowing, there was a calm, a deep, quiet calm, the kind that holds everything in place, the kind that keeps the world steady, the kind that slowly, gently shapes a life. And so, without noticing, without resistance, a generation continued forward, living within the lines, moving within the rhythm, carrying obedience not as a burden, but as something that simply was.
Morning did not arrive as a surprise anymore. It arrived as a continuation, a soft extension of what had already been happening for as long as anyone could remember. The light entered the room in the same way it always had, slow, even, unhurried. It touched the walls, the floor, the familiar shapes of furniture that never seemed to move. And with that light, the day began again. The child rose without thinking. There was no need to decide, no need to hesitate. The body simply followed the pattern it had learned so deeply that it no longer felt like learning at all. In the kitchen, everything was already in place. The same cups, the same plates,
the same quiet arrangement of objects that had not changed in years. Breakfast happened in silence that felt natural now, not forced, not imposed, just expected. Outside, the world looked unchanged. The road stretched forward with its usual patience. The trees stood still, their leaves moving only slightly in the morning air. Even the sky seemed familiar, as if it had been seen many times before in the exact same shade. As the child walked, there was less awareness of surroundings than there once had been, not because the world was gone, but because attention had narrowed, softly, gradually, like a candle flame growing smaller in a still room. There was a time when small details might have felt interesting, a shifting shadow, a distant sound, a shape in the clouds. But now these things passed without holding the mind for long. They appeared and then faded, without meaning, without weight. Inside the classroom, the air was warm and still, the same desks, the same arrangement, the same quiet order. Even the light through the windows seemed to fall in the same gentle pattern it always had. Lessons continued in a steady flow, nothing hurried, nothing unexpected. Each instruction connected to the last, like steps in a path that had already been walked many times before. The children responded as they always did, not quickly out of excitement, but calmly out of understanding. They knew the rhythm now. They lived inside it. There was no need for reminders anymore, no need for correction in loud or visible ways, because the correction had already happened long ago, softly, repeatedly, until it became internal. A pause before speaking, a careful choice of words, a quiet awareness of space and timing. These were no longer lessons, they were habits, and habits, once settled deeply enough, no longer feel like choices. They simply feel like the only way to move forward. As the day continued, the same pattern unfolded. Work, study, brief moments of rest, each one placed carefully between the others, each one blending into the next without sharp edges. Even time itself felt less noticeable. There were no sudden changes, no sharp divisions between hours, only a soft unfolding, one moment dissolving gently into another. By midday, the world outside felt warm but distant. The sound of life carried softly through the air, but even that sound felt far away, as if it belonged to another layer of existence. Inside, everything remained contained, orderly, quiet, predictable. There was comfort in that predictability, a deep, steady comfort that came from knowing what would happen next, from knowing what would never change. But beneath that comfort, there was also a quiet narrowing. A space that once might have held more openness now felt gently reduced, not taken away, not removed, just less available. Thoughts still came, but they did not stay long. They passed through the mind like distant movement outside a window, seen briefly, then gone. And in their place, something else remained, something simpler, something steadier, a focus on what was immediate, what was required, what was already known. As the afternoon light softened, the school day came to its natural close. There was no moment of celebration, no sense of ending, only transition. Books were closed with care, desks were left in order, chairs returned to their places, everything restored to quiet balance. The walk home carried the same rhythm as every other walk, step after step, path after path, no variation needed, no decision required. At home, the same structure continued. Tasks waited quietly, not demanding, not urgent, simply present, and they were completed in the same steady way they always had been,
without resistance, without hesitation, without question. Even rest was shaped by routine now, a familiar position, a familiar silence, a familiar stillness settling in the body. There were moments, sometimes, when something almost felt different, a pause that lingered a little longer than usual, a thought that nearly formed into something new, but those moments dissolved quickly, softly, without struggle, because the world around them did not encourage change. It encouraged continuation, consistency, flow. And over time, continuation became everything, the only thing that mattered, the only thing that made sense. As the evening arrived, the light dimmed once again. The familiar glow returned inside the home, soft, warm, even. And in that gentle light, life continued as it always had, without interruption, without deviation, without noise. The night came slowly, like it always did, like it always would. And as sleep approached, there was no sense that anything needed to be understood differently, no sense that anything was missing, only the quiet acceptance of another day that had passed exactly as expected. And so it ended, not with a conclusion, but with continuation.
Morning returned again, but it no longer felt like a beginning. It felt like a return to something already in motion, a soft unfolding of the same familiar shape that life had taken yesterday, and the day before that, and so many days before that they had begun to blend together. Light entered the room gently, without urgency. It spread across the floor in a slow, steady way, touching the same corners as always, as if even the light itself had learned the boundaries of the space. The child rose, as they always did, without thought. There was no hesitation anymore, no small moment of resistance between sleep and waking. The transition had become seamless, like a door that no longer needed to be opened. It simply allowed passage. In the kitchen, everything remained exactly where it should be. The same quiet arrangement of objects, the same worn surfaces, the same soft sounds of early movement. A cup placed down, a chair adjusted slightly, a small breath in the still air. Nothing more than needed, nothing less than expected. Breakfast passed like a gentle shadow of time, not rushed, not delayed, just present. Food was eaten in small, even motions. Hands moved with calm familiarity, and silence stayed with them, not as absence, but as part of the room itself. Outside, the world was awake in its own quiet way. The sky held its steady tone. The wind moved lightly through distant trees. The ground carried the same worn paths as always. Nothing appeared new. Nothing demanded attention. Everything simply continued. The walk to school had become something the body did without asking. Feet found the path on their own. Turns happened at the right places without thought. Even posture had learned its shape. Straight enough, still enough, measured enough. There was a time when the journey might have felt longer, when each step might have held curiosity. But now time moved differently, not faster or slower, just quieter, less noticeable. Inside the classroom, the atmosphere was unchanged. The same stillness filled the space, the same soft light through the windows, the same sense that everything was already arranged in its proper order. Lessons continued, but it was difficult to say where one lesson ended and another began. Everything flowed together, words repeating, ideas reinforcing, instructions blending into memory. The children listened with steady attention, not strained, not eager, just present. A presence that had learned how to remain within certain limits, and within those limits, everything felt stable, predictable, safe.
But safety, when it becomes constant, begins to shape more than behavior. It shapes perception itself. Over time, the mind no longer looks outward for possibility. It looks inward for confirmation, for what is already known, for what has already been accepted. A question may still appear, faintly, but it does not expand. It does not develop into something larger. It passes through the mind like a soft ripple across still water, gone almost as soon as it arrives. The teacher's voice remained steady, neither harsh nor warm, just consistent, like the ticking of a distant clock that never changes its rhythm. And the children learned to align themselves with that rhythm, not because they were forced, but because it became easier than not aligning. Outside, the day moved toward its middle without urgency. Light shifted gently across surfaces. Shadows lengthened in slow, unremarkable ways. Work and study continued. Small tasks, repeated actions, familiar sequences. Nothing interrupted the flow. Nothing broke it apart. There was a comfort in this continuity, a sense that the world would not suddenly shift or surprise them, that everything would remain within reach of understanding. But there was also a quiet narrowing, a subtle reduction of space where spontaneity once lived, not removed, not destroyed, just less active, less present. By the time afternoon arrived, movement had become almost ceremonial, not in a formal sense, but in the way repetition gives shape to action. Each step felt known before it happened. Each task felt already completed in the mind before the hands began. The walk home carried the same softness as always, the same steady rhythm, the same quiet awareness of path and timing. And yet, something inside that rhythm had deepened, not changed, but settled, like sediment slowly forming at the bottom of still water. At home, the pattern continued without interruption. Tasks were completed in sequence. Spaces were kept in order. Voices remained low, measured, calm. Even rest followed its own structure now. A moment of sitting, a moment of stillness, a moment of quiet observation of nothing in particular. There was no need to search for meaning in it. Meaning had already been assigned by repetition, by expectation, by time itself. Evening came as it always did, softly, gradually, without announcement. The light dimmed into warm shadows that filled the room with familiar stillness. Inside that stillness, everything felt contained, held gently in place by routine, by memory, by habit. And inside that containment, life continued, not moving forward in a visible way, but deepening inward, becoming more settled with each passing day. There were moments, sometimes, when the mind almost reached beyond it, a faint feeling of something different, something slightly wider, less defined. But those moments never stayed long enough to form shape. They faded quietly, like breath dissolving into air. Night returned, the final softness of the day settling over everything. The same silence that had always been there, the same quiet presence that had always followed them. And as sleep arrived again, it did not feel like an escape. It felt like completion, a gentle closing of what had already been fully lived. Nothing ended, nothing began. Everything simply continued, in stillness.
Morning came again, but it no longer felt separate from the night before. It felt attached to it, like a soft continuation of the same long, unbroken thread. Light entered the room in its usual way, not bright, not sudden, just steady, patient, and familiar. It reached across the floor, touched the walls, and rested there, as if it had always belonged. The child woke without noticing the moment of waking. There was no clear boundary between sleep and awareness anymore, only a slow return to motion, breath, stillness, then movement. The house remained unchanged, objects placed exactly where they had been left, the faint memory of yesterday still resting in the air, though nothing could be seen of it. Everything felt gently paused, as if the world had never fully restarted. It simply continued. Breakfast was simple, as always, not because it lacked care, but because care itself had become quiet, measured, predictable. The same actions repeated in the same order, not out of necessity, but out of understanding that this was how mornings worked. Outside, the air carried a mild stillness, not empty, not alive, just balanced, somewhere in between. The trees did not move much, the sky did not shift quickly, even distant sounds seemed softened as if they had learned not to disturb the surface of things. The walk to school unfolded without thought. Each step followed the last with calm certainty. There was no need to look far ahead, no need to consider alternatives. The path already existed, and it always led where it needed to lead. Inside the classroom, the familiar arrangement waited. The same silence, the same order, the same steady presence of expectation. Everything had its place without needing to be reminded. Lessons continued in their quiet, repetitive flow. Words spoken slowly, repeated gently, written carefully. Nothing rushed, nothing emphasized. Everything balanced in a calm, even rhythm. The children no longer reacted strongly to instruction, not because they were distant, but because they had learned the shape of response. When to move, when to pause, when to remain still. It had all become a language without words, and like any language learned deeply enough, it no longer required conscious thought. Outside the classroom, the world carried on in its usual softness. The same routines unfolding in homes and small streets, the same quiet labor, the same careful repetition of daily life. There was comfort in this predictability, a kind of reassurance that nothing would break or collapse unexpectedly, that life would remain within the familiar lines it had always drawn. But over time, what remains familiar also becomes less noticed, and what becomes less noticed slowly fades from awareness, not disappearing, just becoming background, like sound that is always present until one forgets to listen for it. Within the children, something subtle was happening, not a change that could be pointed to, not a moment that could be remembered, but a slow shaping of attention itself. Curiosity still existed, but it no longer reached outward easily. It stayed closer, smaller, more contained. Questions still formed sometimes, but they rarely expanded. They passed through thought briefly, then dissolved, like ripples that never reached the shore. And so the inner world became quieter, not empty, just less active, less inclined to reach beyond what was already known. As the afternoon arrived, light softened once again. The edges of the room grew warmer. Shadows stretched gently across the floor. Everything slowed in appearance, even if time itself continued unchanged. The end of the school day came without ceremony. Books closed, objects returned, movements completed. No sense of departure, only transition. The walk home was familiar in every way. The same turns, the same distance, the same rhythm of steps. So familiar that it no longer felt like a journey, only movement within something already known. At home, the pattern resumed without interruption. Tasks waited quietly and were completed quietly. Nothing resisted, nothing needed to be questioned.
Even small moments of pause had a defined shape now. Sitting, breathing, observing the stillness of the room. Nothing more, nothing less. There was a kind of peace in this structure, a deep, steady peace that came from knowing what would happen next, from never having to guess, from never needing to reach beyond what was already certain. But within that peace, something had slowly receded, not lost all at once, not taken away, just less present with each passing day. A sense of openness, of possibility, of something undefined beyond the edges of routine. It did not vanish dramatically. It simply became harder to notice, like a distant sound slowly blending into silence. Evening arrived gently, the world dimming into its familiar tones. Inside, the soft glow of light created a space that felt enclosed, calm, and complete. And within that completeness, nothing felt missing, because what is absent cannot be felt when it has long since faded from awareness. The night came as it always did, without change, without interruption, without difference. And as sleep returned, it did so quietly, not as escape, but as continuation. Everything remained in place. Everything remained steady. Everything remained as it had always been.
Morning did not announce itself. It simply appeared, a slow lifting of darkness into pale light, as if the world had always been waiting in that exact position, ready to resume without interruption. The room was the same as before. Nothing had shifted during the night in any way that could be noticed, and yet the morning always carried the quiet feeling that time had passed somewhere just out of sight. The child rose with the same unthinking motion. There was no longer a sense of starting the day, only entering it, like stepping into a river that was already flowing. The air inside the home held its familiar calm, stillness resting in the corners, soft light gathering on surfaces, the quiet arrangement of objects unchanged from yesterday. Everything felt settled, not temporary, not fragile, just established. Breakfast unfolded without conversation beyond what was needed. Words were short, pauses were longer. The rhythm between actions mattered more than the actions themselves. A spoon lifted, a cup lowered, a chair shifted slightly, each sound small enough to disappear into the air. Outside, the morning carried its usual softness. The sky was not particularly bright, nor particularly dull. It simply existed in a steady, neutral tone. The world did not demand attention. It only offered continuity. The walk to school was the same as always. The same distance, the same turns, the same quiet awareness of where each step should land. There was a kind of ease in this repetition, a comfort in not needing to decide anything. But comfort, over time, begins to shape perception in subtle ways. What is repeated often becomes what is expected, and what is expected becomes what is unnoticed. Inside the classroom, everything waited in its usual arrangement. The stillness was not forced. It had become natural to the space itself, as if the room preferred silence over sound. Lessons continued in their steady rhythm, not rising or falling in intensity, just flowing evenly forward, like water moving through a channel already carved long ago. The children responded in quiet coordination, not as individuals pulling in different directions, but as a group that had learned the same boundaries of movement, the same boundaries of thought, the same boundaries of expression. And within those boundaries, life felt orderly, predictable, manageable. But boundaries, even when gentle, begin to define what remains outside them, and over time, what remains outside is less and less considered. There were moments when a child might begin to think beyond the immediate task, a fleeting image, a half-formed idea, a small curiosity about something not yet explained. But these moments rarely expanded. They softened quickly and then faded, not because they were removed, but because nothing in the environment asked them to grow. Outside, the world followed its own quiet patterns: work, movement, repetition. Everything aligned with a steady, familiar structure. Nothing sharp, nothing sudden, only continuation. By midday, the light had shifted slightly, still soft, still even, casting long, gentle shapes across the floor. Time felt visible in that light, but not urgent. The afternoon lessons carried the same calm tone. No urgency to finish, no urgency to begin, only the slow movement from one point to the next. The children had learned how to remain within that movement, how to match its pace, how to avoid stepping outside it. And so attention narrowed again, not through force, but through adaptation, through repetition, through the quiet agreement between mind and environment. The walk home came with the same rhythm as always, the same path beneath the feet, the same familiar surroundings passing without change. Even small variations in the world felt less important now, less noticeable. At home, tasks were completed in their usual order. Nothing delayed, nothing questioned, nothing rearranged. Everything followed its expected place. Even rest had become structured in its simplicity. A moment of sitting, a moment of stillness, a moment where nothing needed to be done. There was peace in that structure, a peace that came from certainty, from repetition, from the absence of interruption. But within that peace, something continued to drift further away, not suddenly, not clearly, just gradually becoming less present in awareness, a sense of openness, of unpredictability, of life extending beyond the edges of what was already known. It did not disappear, it simply stopped being reached for. Evening arrived in its familiar softness, light fading gently, air cooling slowly, the world outside becoming less defined. Inside, the glow of the room held everything in a warm, quiet frame, contained, steady, familiar. And within that frame, nothing felt missing, because nothing was actively remembered as missing. Night came as it always did, without resistance, without change, without interruption. And sleep followed naturally, like a continuation of stillness rather than an escape from the day. Everything remained as it had been. Everything remained as it would be, quiet, steady, unmoving in its rhythm.
Morning arrived again, soft and unremarkable. It did not feel like a beginning anymore. It felt like a return to something already familiar, something already understood without needing to be noticed. Light spread slowly across the room, touching the same surfaces it had touched countless times before. Nothing about it asked for attention. Nothing about it needed to be remembered. The child woke in the same quiet way as always. There was no moment of surprise in being awake, only the gentle awareness that the day had already started without needing permission. Breathing, stillness, movement, everything followed in order, as if the body had its own memory of how to proceed. The home remained unchanged, not because nothing ever happened, but because everything that happened fit within a very narrow shape, a shape that had become familiar enough to feel permanent. Breakfast came and went in its usual silence, the same small gestures repeated without thought, the same careful spacing between actions, a life built not on urgency, but on repetition so steady it became invisible. Outside, the air carried a quiet neutrality, not cold, not warm in a way that demanded notice, just present, just continuing. The world seemed to prefer not to stand out. The walk to school happened without reflection. Feet moved forward without instruction. The body already knew the route better than the mind did. There was no need to observe the surroundings anymore. They were already known, or at least they felt known. Inside the classroom, everything was in its usual state. Stillness held the space gently, like something that belonged there naturally. Desks, light, air, all arranged into a quiet order that never needed adjustment. Lessons moved forward in the same steady flow. Nothing emphasized too strongly, nothing lingered too long. Everything passed through time evenly, like a slow current that never changed direction. The children followed that current, not resisting it, not questioning it, simply moving with it because it was easier than moving against it. And over time, easier became the strongest force in the room, stronger than curiosity, stronger than hesitation, stronger than the small inner voice that sometimes wondered if things could be different. That voice still appeared occasionally, faintly, like a distant sound carried through thick air, but it no longer grew into anything larger. It arrived and then softened and then disappeared. Outside the classroom, life continued in its steady way. Work followed routine. Routines followed expectation. Expectation followed memory. Everything connected without interruption. Everything repeated without resistance. There was comfort in this structure, a deep, quiet comfort that came from knowing what would happen next without needing to ask, from never needing to prepare for something unknown, from never being surprised. But in that same comfort, something else slowly settled, a narrowing of attention, a shrinking of what the mind considered important. Not all at once, not in any visible way, but gradually, like a landscape becoming less varied over time. Fewer details noticed, fewer questions formed, fewer possibilities imagined. By midday, the light outside had softened into a steady glow. Nothing harsh, nothing dramatic, just the same gentle illumination that made everything look slightly distant. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm. Tasks, instructions, movements, each one blending into the next, each one requiring less and less thought. And the less thought required, the more automatic everything became, until action and habit were no longer separate things. They were the same thing. The walk home felt even quieter than before, not because the world had become quieter, but because attention had become smaller, more contained, more inward. At home, everything continued without interruption. The same small responsibilities, the same familiar sequence of tasks, the same quiet acceptance that nothing would change unexpectedly. Even rest no longer felt like a separate state. It was simply another part of the pattern, a pause within movement, not an escape from it. There were still moments when awareness briefly expanded, a sound in the distance, a change in light, a thought that almost formed into curiosity. But these moments were brief. They did not grow. They passed through without leaving a mark. Evening arrived gently, as it always did, the light fading in slow stages, the room becoming softer, quieter, more enclosed. Inside that enclosure, everything felt complete. Not exciting, not fulfilling in any dramatic way, just complete, in the sense that nothing felt missing strongly enough to be named. And that absence of missing became its own kind of balance, a stillness that required no adjustment, a calm that asked for nothing more. Night returned without notice, the same gentle closing of the day, the same quiet settling of everything into place. And sleep came easily,
not as a release, but as a continuation of the same steady rhythm that had carried the entire day. Nothing shifted, nothing broke, nothing changed direction. Everything remained within its soft, familiar boundaries, and within those boundaries, life continued, quietly, steadily, and without interruption.
Morning came again with a kind of quiet patience. It did not feel new anymore. It felt remembered, as if the entire world was gently replaying something it had already learned long ago, without needing to think about it. Light moved slowly across the room, resting in the same familiar places, like it had been here many times before and knew exactly where to go. The child woke without transition. There was no moment of arrival into consciousness, only a soft continuation, like a thread never broken. Breath, stillness, movement, all happening in the same calm order, without effort. The home remained exactly as it had been, not just in objects, but in feeling. A quiet consistency filled every corner, as if even the air had learned to hold itself in the same way each day. Breakfast passed gently, the same motions repeated without interruption. Hands moved, food was taken, silence stayed. Nothing needed to be added to complete the moment. It already felt complete. Outside, the world carried its steady tone, not silent, not loud, just evenly present, like background that never changes. The walk to school felt shorter now, though it was not. It only felt that way because attention no longer measured distance in the same way. Time had softened. Space had simplified. Each step was familiar before it happened. Each movement followed a path already known. There was no need to observe the surroundings closely. They had already been observed enough times to feel permanent. Inside the classroom, stillness had become almost natural to the environment itself, not imposed, not enforced, just existing, as if it belonged there more than anything else. Lessons continued in their slow, steady rhythm. No sharp beginning, no clear ending, just continuation. One thought gently leading into the next without emphasis. The children no longer waited for instruction in the same way. They anticipated it, not consciously, but as a natural response shaped by repetition. And in that anticipation, there was no tension, only readiness, a readiness that required less and less awareness over time. There was a quiet efficiency in how everything unfolded now, movements aligned with expectation so smoothly that resistance no longer had space to appear, and what does not resist long enough eventually becomes indistinguishable from acceptance. Outside the classroom, life moved in its familiar layers: work, routine, repetition, each layer supporting the next, forming a structure that rarely changed shape. There was comfort in that structure, a sense of reliability that came from knowing what each moment would contain, from never needing to prepare for anything unexpected. But in that same reliability, something subtle continued to settle. Not loss, not absence, but reduction, a quiet shrinking of how wide the world felt. Fewer details stood out. Fewer differences were noticed. Fewer variations seemed meaningful. Everything began to feel slightly closer together, slightly more uniform, slightly more the same. By midday, light filled the room in its usual softened way. Nothing harsh, nothing distinct, just a steady brightness that made everything feel evenly present. Afternoon passed in the same quiet flow. Tasks followed tasks. Moments followed moments. Nothing interrupted the sequence long enough to break it. Even thought itself seemed to move more slowly now, not because it was forced to, but because there was less need for it to move quickly. The walk home was unchanged.
The same path, the same pace, the same quiet awareness of movement without reflection. At home, the routine continued seamlessly. Everything placed, everything completed, everything settled into its expected position. Even silence felt structured now, not empty, but arranged, like something that had found its own form and stayed there. There were still brief moments when something faintly different seemed to appear, a thought not fully formed, a feeling without clear shape, a sense of something just beyond recognition. But those moments did not expand. They softened quickly and then dissolved into the background of the day, not rejected, not explored, just gently passed over. Evening arrived in its familiar way, soft light fading into soft shadow, the world becoming quieter without effort. Inside, the glow of the room held everything in a calm, enclosed stillness, a stillness that felt complete because nothing inside it was asking to move. And within that completeness, life continued without interruption, not progressing in a visible direction, but deepening into familiarity. Night returned as it always did, not as contrast, but as continuation of the same soft rhythm that carried everything else. And sleep came gently, without resistance, not as escape, but part of the same ongoing flow. Nothing shifted, nothing broke, nothing changed its shape. Everything remained within the quiet boundaries it had slowly learned to inhabit. And within those boundaries, the days continued, softly, steadily, and without end.
Morning came again, but it no longer felt separate from the night before. It felt attached to it, like a soft continuation of the same long, unbroken thread. Light entered the room in its usual way, not bright, not sudden, just steady, patient, and familiar. It reached across the floor, touched the walls, and rested there, as if it had always belonged. The child woke without noticing the moment of waking. There was no clear boundary between sleep and awareness anymore, only a slow return to motion, breath, stillness, then movement. The house remained unchanged, objects placed exactly where they had been left, the faint memory of yesterday still resting in the air, though nothing could be seen of it. Everything felt gently paused, as if the world had never fully restarted. It simply continued. Breakfast was simple, as always, not because it lacked care, but because care itself had become quiet, measured, predictable. The same actions repeated in the same order, not out of necessity, but out of understanding that this was how mornings worked. Outside, the air carried a mild stillness, not empty, not alive, just balanced somewhere in between. The trees did not move much, the sky did not shift quickly, even distant sounds seemed softened as if they had learned not to disturb the surface of things. The walk to school unfolded without thought. Each step followed the last with calm certainty. There was no need to look far ahead, no need to consider alternatives. The path already existed, and it always led where it needed to lead. Inside the classroom, the familiar arrangement waited. The same silence, the same order, the same steady presence of expectation. Everything had its place without needing to be reminded. Lessons continued in their quiet, repetitive flow. Words spoken slowly, repeated gently, written carefully. Nothing rushed, nothing emphasized. Everything balanced in a calm, even rhythm. The children no longer reacted strongly to instruction, not because they were distant, but because they had learned the shape of response, when to move, when to pause, when to remain still. It had all become a language without words, and like any language learned deeply enough,
It no longer required conscious thought. Outside the classroom, the world carried on in its usual softness. The same routines unfolding in homes and small streets, the same quiet labor, the same careful repetition of daily life. There was comfort in this predictability, a kind of reassurance that nothing would break or collapse unexpectedly, that life would remain within the familiar lines it had always drawn. But over time, what remains familiar also becomes less noticed, and what becomes less noticed slowly fades from awareness, not disappearing, just becoming background, like sound that is always present until one forgets to listen for it. Within the children, something subtle was happening, not a change that could be pointed to, not a moment that could be remembered, but a slow shaping of attention itself. Curiosity still existed, but it no longer reached outward easily. It stayed closer, smaller, more contained. Questions still formed sometimes, but they rarely expanded. They passed through thought briefly, then dissolved, like ripples that never reached the shore. And so the inner world became quieter, not empty, just less active, less inclined to reach beyond what was already known. As the afternoon arrived, light softened once again. The edges of the room grew warmer. Shadows stretched gently across the floor. Everything slowed in appearance, even if time itself continued unchanged. The end of the school day came without ceremony. Books closed, objects returned, movements completed. No sense of departure, only transition. The walk home was familiar in every way. The same turns, the same distance, the same rhythm of steps. So familiar that it no longer felt like a journey, only movement within something already known. At home, the pattern resumed without interruption. Tasks waited quietly and were completed quietly. Nothing resisted, nothing needed to be questioned. Even small moments of pause had a defined shape now. Sitting, breathing, observing the stillness of the room. Nothing more, nothing less. There was a kind of peace in this structure, a deep, steady peace that came from knowing what would happen next, from never having to guess, from never needing to reach beyond what was already certain. But within that peace, something had slowly receded, not lost all at once, not taken away, just less present with each passing day. A sense of openness, of possibility, of something undefined beyond the edges of routine. It did not vanish dramatically. It simply became harder to notice, like a distant sound slowly blending into silence. Evening arrived gently, the world dimming into its familiar tones. Inside, the soft glow of light created a space that felt enclosed, calm, and complete. And within that completeness, nothing felt missing, because what is absent cannot be felt when it has long since faded from awareness. The night came as it always did, without change, without interruption, without difference. And as sleep returned, it did so quietly, not as escape, but as continuation. Everything remained in place. Everything remained steady. Everything remained as it had always been.
Morning returned again, and by now it felt less like an event and more like a familiar continuation of something already in motion. The light did not arrive with notice. It simply appeared, resting softly against the room as if it had always been there. Nothing about it demanded attention. Nothing about it needed response. The child woke in the same quiet rhythm that had shaped so many mornings before. There was no awareness of change between sleep and waking, only the gentle sense that it was time to exist in the day again. Breathing, stillness, movement, all unfolding in their usual order. The home remained steady and unchanged, not frozen, not empty, just consistent in a way that no longer felt temporary. Even the smallest details seemed to belong permanently to their places. Breakfast was simple, as always, not lacking anything, not needing anything more. Just a quiet sequence of familiar actions that filled the space between morning and movement. Outside, the world was calm in its ordinary way. The sky held its soft tone. The air carried a neutral warmth. The surroundings did not shift in any noticeable direction. Everything felt gently paused, even while continuing. The walk to school happened without reflection. There was no decision in the movement, only repetition guiding each step forward. A path so often traveled it no longer required attention to follow. Inside the classroom, silence had become part of the architecture, not something added, something embedded. The room seemed designed around stillness itself. Lessons continued, steady and unmarked by urgency. No moment felt more important than another. Everything unfolded evenly, like a slow stream moving through familiar ground. The children responded with quiet coordination, not as individuals thinking separately, but as a group shaped by the same pattern over time. And patterns, when repeated long enough, begin to replace thought with expectation. There was less hesitation now before actions, less internal discussion, less searching for alternatives. What needed to be done was simply done, not because it was forced, but because it had become the easiest path forward. Outside, life continued in its usual form: work, routine, order, each part reinforcing the next, each day resembling the one before it closely enough to feel connected. There was comfort in this sameness, a calm reassurance that nothing would disrupt the flow of life, that everything would remain understandable, predictable, manageable. But within that comfort, something subtle continued to narrow, not suddenly, not visibly, but steadily, like a quiet closing of distance. The world did not feel smaller, but it felt less varied, less surprising, less open. By midday, light filled the space in its usual soft way, not drawing attention to itself, not changing in any dramatic fashion, just continuing. Afternoon unfolded with the same measured pace. Tasks followed one another without interruption. Time moved forward without resistance. Even thought became quieter, not absent, but less active, less inclined to expand beyond what was immediately present. The walk home was familiar in every detail. The same ground, the same rhythm, the same quiet acceptance of movement without reflection. At home, everything continued as expected. Objects in place, actions repeated, silence maintained. Nothing asked for adjustment, nothing required reconsideration. Even pauses felt structured now. Moments of stillness had their own familiar shape, a kind of rest that was still within the pattern of the day. There were still faint moments of awareness that did not fully belong to routine, a brief sense of something unspoken, a thought that almost formed into curiosity, a feeling without clear direction. But those moments did not grow. They passed gently through awareness and dissolved, not interrupted, not suppressed, just unheld. Evening arrived in its soft, familiar way, light fading slowly, air cooling slightly, the world settling into a quieter tone. Inside, the room held a steady warmth that made everything feel contained, safe in its predictability, comfortable in its repetition. And within that comfort, nothing felt incomplete, because completeness over time becomes defined by familiarity rather than change. Night came as it always had, without shift,
without surprise, without difference, and sleep followed naturally as part of the same continuous rhythm that had carried the entire day. Nothing broke the pattern, nothing interrupted it, nothing stood outside it. Everything remained within the soft boundaries that life had gradually learned to accept. And within those boundaries, the days continued, quietly, steadily, and without end.
Morning arrived again, but it no longer carried any sense of distinction. It did not feel separate from the day before. It did not feel new. It felt like the same moment, gently extended forward without interruption. Light entered the room in its usual way, soft, even, unhurried, resting where it always rested, as if it had memorized the space and no longer needed to look. The child woke in silence that felt complete in its familiarity. There was no recognition of transition, no awareness that something had begun, only the quiet continuation of being awake. Breath, stillness, movement, all occurring without thought. The home remained unchanged in ways that no longer drew attention. Objects did not feel placed anymore. They simply felt correct, as if they had always been there in that exact position, even when no one was looking. Breakfast passed with its usual calm rhythm. The same sequence of actions unfolded without variation. Hands moved, food was taken, silence remained. Nothing asked to be different, and nothing was. Outside, the world appeared in its familiar softness. The sky was neither bright nor dim in any way that stood out. It simply existed in a steady, unremarkable state. The air moved gently, without urgency or direction. The walk to school required no awareness beyond movement itself. Feet followed a path that felt less like a route and more like memory embodied in the body. There was no need to observe surroundings closely. They had already been seen enough times to feel permanent. Inside the classroom, stillness was no longer noticeable as stillness. It had become the normal condition of the space. Like silence that has lasted so long, it no longer feels like silence. It just feels like how things are. Lessons continued in their slow, even flow. No emphasis rose above the rest. No moment felt more important than another. Everything moved forward evenly, without interruption or emphasis. The children responded in quiet alignment, not through effort, not through hesitation, but through a kind of automatic understanding shaped by repetition. And repetition over time becomes a softer kind of instruction than words ever were. There was less internal contrast now, less difference between choice and response, less distance between thought and action. Things simply happened in the way they were expected to happen, not because expectation was spoken, but because it had become the only familiar structure left. Outside, life continued in its steady, unremarkable form. Work, routine, repetition. Each day resembling the last in ways that no longer required reflection. There was comfort in this sameness, a quiet reassurance that nothing unpredictable would enter the day, that nothing would need to be relearned or readjusted. But over time, sameness does something subtle. It reduces contrast, and without contrast, even memory begins to soften its edges. Things that once felt different begin to feel similar. Things that once stood out begin to blend, and eventually, what remains is only a smooth continuity of experience. By midday, light rested evenly across everything. No shadows felt stronger than others. No corners felt more distinct. Everything shared the same quiet tone. Afternoon unfolded in its usual way. Tasks followed tasks. Moments followed moments. Nothing broke the sequence. Nothing needed to. Even attention itself felt less divided now, less pulled in different directions, more centered on what was immediately present. The walk home was as familiar as ever, so familiar that it no longer felt like movement through space, only movement through repetition. At home, the same structure waited without needing to be maintained. It simply continued existing on its own, as if it no longer required effort to remain in place. Even small pauses had become part of the routine, not interruptions, not breaks, just quiet intervals already accounted for within the flow of the day. There were moments, faint, brief, almost imperceptible, when something slightly different might have been sensed. A thought without clear direction, a feeling without name, a sense of something not fully contained by routine. But these moments did not develop. They did not expand. They passed gently through awareness and dissolved into the background of everything else. Not rejected, not examined, simply not held. Evening arrived as it always did, soft light fading into soft stillness, the world easing into its familiar quiet tone. Inside, everything felt contained within a gentle order. Nothing needed correction, nothing needed attention, nothing needed change. And within that order, life continued without distinction between one day and the next, not moving forward in any visible way, but continuing in an uninterrupted state of sameness. Night came without notice, the same soft closing of the day, the same quiet settling of everything into place, and sleep followed naturally as if it had never been separate from waking at all. Nothing shifted, nothing broke, nothing changed its outline. Everything remained within the soft, familiar boundaries that had slowly become the shape of life itself. And within those boundaries, the days continued, quietly, steadily, and without end.
Morning returned again, but it did not feel like a return. It felt like something already ongoing, something that had never truly stopped. The light came in slowly, resting across the room in the same gentle way it always did, as if it had no reason to ever change its behavior. Nothing in the room reacted to it. Everything simply accepted it. The child woke in the same quiet continuity. There was no sense of beginning, no sense of arrival, only the soft awareness of being here, again, as if there had never been anywhere else to be. Breathing continued without notice. Stillness dissolved into movement. The day unfolded without instruction. The home held its familiar shape, not through effort, not through maintenance, but through repetition so steady it no longer felt like repetition at all. It simply felt like permanence. Breakfast came in its usual quiet sequence. The same actions, the same order, the same silence between movements. Nothing about it required attention anymore. It was simply part of the structure of living. Outside, the world remained in its gentle, unremarkable state. The sky showed no urgency. The air carried no demand. Everything existed in a soft balance that never tilted too far in any direction. The walk to school was no longer experienced as a journey. It was a transition within familiarity, a movement through something already known so completely it no longer felt external. Inside the classroom, stillness had become indistinguishable from normality. There was no awareness of silence, because silence had become the default condition of the space. Lessons continued in their steady, unchanging flow. Nothing emphasized, nothing disrupted. everything proceeding in the same even rhythm that had been established long before anyone in the room could remember. The children no longer waited for instruction in the way they once might have. They responded before instruction fully arrived, not out of anticipation, but out of alignment. And alignment, once established deeply enough, no longer feels like choice. It feels like nature. Outside the classroom, life continued in its familiar cycle: work, routine, repetition. Each element reinforcing the next, forming a structure that no longer needed to be explained. There was comfort in that structure, a comfort that came from predictability so complete it erased uncertainty entirely. From days that never required adjustment, from moments that never required decision. But within that comfort, something continued to fin quietly, not disappear, not vanish, just slowly lose definition. The sense of different became harder to recognize. The sense of new became harder to feel. Even change, when it occurred, no longer stood out clearly enough to be noticed. By midday, the world rested in its usual calm light. Everything appeared evenly present. Nothing demanded attention more than anything else. Afternoon passed in its steady, unmarked way. Tasks completed themselves through habit. Time moved forward without resistance or recognition. Even thought, when it appeared, followed familiar paths. It no longer wandered far. It no longer searched widely. It stayed close to what was already known. The walk home carried the same soft rhythm as every other walk before it. So familiar, it no longer required awareness, only motion. At home, the structure continued without interruption. Everything in place, everything accounted for, everything gently maintained by repetition itself. Even silence had lost its contrast. It was no longer something noticed between sounds. It was simply the condition in which everything existed. There were still faint moments when something almost different appeared, a thought that did not fully form, a feeling without clear shape, a brief opening that never became wide enough to enter. But these moments faded quickly, not interrupted, not resisted, just gently dissolved back into the ongoing quiet of the day. Evening arrived as it always did, soft light thinning into stillness, the world settling without effort into its familiar calm. Inside, everything felt complete in its consistency. Nothing felt missing strongly enough to be named. Nothing felt uncertain enough to question. And so completeness became defined not by fullness, but by continuity. Night came gently, without change in tone, without interruption of rhythm, without distinction from the day before. And sleep followed as part of that same quiet flow. Not an ending, not a separation, just another phase of the same quiet flow. Everything remained in place. Everything remained unchanged in its essence. Everything continued without needing to become anything different. And within that unchanging rhythm, the days moved forward, softly, steadily, and without end.
Morning came again, but even the idea of again felt less clear now. There was only the gentle return of light, the same quiet room, the same familiar stillness that did not feel like it had ever been interrupted. It simply was there, always. The child woke without awareness of change. No boundary marked the shift from sleep to waking. No moment stood out as the beginning of anything. Only continuity, soft, even, unbroken. The home remained in its quiet arrangement, not because it was maintained carefully every moment, but because nothing disturbed it enough to make it feel different from before. Everything seemed to settle back into place on its own. Breakfast happened in the same gentle sequence. the same movements repeated without emphasis. Hands, objects, silence, each taking its place without needing instruction. Outside, the world felt neither near nor far. It simply existed in a steady presence that no longer invited close observation. The sky was there, the air was there, the ground was there, and that was enough. The walk to school passed without distinction. There was no sense of going anywhere anymore, only shifting through familiar space that did not feel separate from home. Inside the classroom, stillness had become so complete that it no longer felt like stillness. It felt like the natural state of being, a quiet agreement between people and space. Lessons continued in their steady, unchanging rhythm. Nothing rose in importance above anything else. Everything flowed evenly forward without sharp edges. The children no longer marked time through events. They marked it through repetition, through patterns that returned so reliably they replaced awareness of time itself. And when repetition becomes the measure of life, difference begins to fade quietly into the background. Outside the classroom, life continued in its same gentle structure. Work, routine, order, not as separate things, but as parts of one continuous motion. There was comfort in this continuity, a comfort that required no explanation, a comfort that came from not needing to think beyond what was already present. But over time, something subtle continued to shift, not outwardly, not visibly, but in how things were felt internally. The sense of contrast between one moment and the next began to soften. One day felt less distinct from another. One experience felt less separate from the next. Even memory began to lose sharpness, not in forgetting, but in blending, in merging, in becoming part of a larger, undivided flow. By midday, light filled everything in the same even way it always had. No surface stood out more than another. No moment felt brighter or darker in meaning. Everything shared the same tone. Afternoon passed without interruption or emphasis. Tasks followed tasks. Actions followed actions, each one blending smoothly into the next. Even attention itself had become quieter, less divided, less searching, more settled into what was immediately present. The walk home felt familiar in a way that no longer required recognition. It was not remembered as familiar, it simply was familiar. At home, the same structure waited without needing to be maintained. It existed on its own, sustained by repetition so steady it no longer felt like effort. Even silence had stopped being noticed as silence. It was simply the background in which everything happened, unmarked, unseparated, unnamed. There were still faint moments when something almost different appeared, a brief impression, a slight emotional shift, a thought without clear direction. But these moments did not expand. They did not hold shape long enough to become something distinct. They passed through awareness gently and dissolved. Not removed, not pushed away, just not held. Evening arrived in its familiar softness, light fading evenly across the room, everything becoming quieter without anything actively changing. Inside, everything felt complete in its consistency, not because everything was full, but because nothing broke the pattern. And in the absence of breaking, continuity becomes the definition of completeness. Night came as it always had, without separation, without contrast, without change in feeling or form. And sleep followed as a continuation rather than an ending, a gentle merging into the same steady rhythm that carried everything else. Nothing stood apart anymore. Nothing interrupted the flow. Nothing marked the difference between one moment and the next.
Everything remained within the same soft, unbroken continuity, and the days continued, quietly, steadily, and without end.
Morning arrived again, though it no longer carried any sense of arrival. There was no shift from one state into another, only a gentle persistence of light, as if the world had never paused long enough to begin again. The room was the same, the air was the same, the silence was the same, and within that sameness, nothing felt missing. The child woke without noticing the moment of waking. There was no contrast between sleep and awareness anymore, only a smooth continuation, like water moving through the same quiet channel without changing its course. The home remained steady in its familiar arrangement, not because it was carefully kept that way in every moment, but because nothing ever disturbed it enough to make it feel otherwise. It simply stayed. Breakfast unfolded in its usual order, the same small actions, the same gentle spacing between movements, the same quiet presence of silence that no longer felt like absence. Outside, the world offered no interruption, no sharpness, no emphasis, just a soft, continuous existence that did not ask to be noticed closely. The walk to school required no thought. There was no sense of distance, no awareness of transition, only movement that felt as natural as breathing. Inside the classroom, stillness had become indistinguishable from the space itself. It was no longer experienced as something present. It was simply how the room existed. Lessons continued in their slow, even rhythm. No rise, no fall, no interruption. Only continuity expressed through repetition. The children responded without hesitation, not because they were instructed in that moment, but because instruction had already been absorbed long before. And what is absorbed deeply enough no longer feels external. It feels like self. Outside, life continued in its familiar pattern. Work, routine, order, each one flowing into the next without clear separation. There was comfort in this structure, a comfort that came not from excitement, but from absence of uncertainty, from knowing what would happen before it happened, from never needing to reach beyond what was already there. But within that comfort, something continued to settle more deeply. Not loss, not change, but quiet reduction, a soft narrowing of how differently things were experienced. The world did not feel smaller, but it felt less varied, less contrasted, less defined by differences that once might have stood out. By midday, light filled everything evenly. No place felt brighter than another. No moment felt more distinct than the next. Everything shared the same gentle tone. Afternoon passed without emphasis. Tasks followed one another in steady sequence. Time moved forward without drawing attention to itself. Even thought, when it appeared, moved within familiar paths. It no longer wandered far. It no longer reached outward. It stayed close to what was already known. The walk home was unchanged, the same rhythm, the same distance, the same quiet movement through familiar space. At home, the structure remained without effort, everything in its place, everything continuing as expected, nothing requiring adjustment. Even silence no longer stood out as silence. It was simply the condition in which everything existed, not noticed, not named, just present. There were still faint moments when something slightly different seemed to appear, a thought that did not fully form, a feeling without direction, a sense of something just beyond clarity. But these moments never developed. They passed through awareness and dissolved into the same quiet continuity as everything else. Not resisted, not explored, just not held. Evening arrived gently, as it always did, light fading into a calm stillness
that filled the room without effort. Inside, everything felt contained within its familiar order. Nothing felt incomplete in a way that required attention. Nothing felt uncertain enough to question. And so completeness became defined not by fullness or change, but by uninterrupted continuation. Night came without distinction, no clear separation from the day, no sharp closing, only a soft transition into stillness. And sleep followed as part of the same continuous rhythm that had carried the entire day. Nothing broke the pattern. Nothing stood outside it. Nothing moved beyond its quiet boundaries. Everything remained within the same steady flow, and the days continued softly, quietly, and without end.
Morning returned, but it no longer felt like something that happened. It felt like something that simply remained. A soft, unbroken presence of light that did not begin or end, but only shifted gently across the room in ways that were almost too subtle to notice. The air was still. The silence was steady. The world felt close, but not in any particular direction. Just here. The child woke without awareness of change. There was no moment of separation between rest and awareness, only continuity, a quiet awareness that did not need to identify itself as new. The home held its familiar stillness, not fragile, not temporary, just established through repetition so long that it no longer felt like it had ever been otherwise. Breakfast unfolded in the same gentle sequence, movements repeated without emphasis, silence remained without effort. Everything aligned in its usual order, as if order itself had become the natural condition of life. Outside, the world continued in its soft, unremarkable presence. Nothing stood out strongly enough to demand attention. Everything existed evenly, balanced in a way that no longer invited observation. The walk to school happened without reflection. There was no awareness of path or distance, only motion within familiarity. And familiarity, when deep enough, no longer feels like recognition. It feels like existence itself. Inside the classroom, stillness had become indistinguishable from normal life. It was no longer something that surrounded activity. It had become the form of activity itself. Lessons continued in their steady flow. No emphasis, no interruption, no contrast, only sequence blending into sequence. The children responded in quiet coordination, not through conscious effort, but through a shared rhythm that had formed over time. And rhythms, once fully established, no longer require thought to follow. They simply carry everything forward. Outside the classroom, life continued in its same quiet pattern. Work, routine, order. Not separate experiences, but one continuous structure expressed in different forms. There was comfort in that structure, a comfort that came from not needing to define anything beyond it, from not needing to compare one moment to another, from not needing to ask whether anything was different. But within that comfort, something continued to soften quietly, not disappearing, not breaking, just becoming less distinct with each passing repetition. Differences between moments faded further. The boundary between one day and the next became less noticeable. Even memory began to feel like part of the same continuous surface. By midday, light filled the space in its familiar evenness. Nothing sharp, nothing contrasted, nothing demanding attention. Afternoon moved forward without interruption. Tasks followed one another in steady succession. Time passed, but without drawing awareness toward itself. Even thought itself felt closer to stillness now, not absent, but no longer stretching outward, remaining close to what was already present. The walk home was unchanged, not remembered as familiar, but experienced as simply the way things are. At home, the structure remained without effort, everything in its place, everything continuing without interruption, everything aligned with its usual order.
Even silence no longer felt like something surrounding life. It felt like life itself, unbroken, unseparated, unmarked. There were still faint impressions of something slightly different, a momentary sense of variation, a thought without clear direction, a feeling that did not fully settle. But these did not grow, they did not take shape. They passed gently through awareness and dissolved into the ongoing quiet, not removed, not resisted, just not held long enough to become anything else. Evening arrived in its familiar softness, light fading slowly without emphasis, the world easing into its usual calm state. Inside, everything felt complete, not because anything had been achieved, but because nothing had been interrupted. And in uninterrupted existence, completion becomes indistinguishable from continuity. Night came without distinction, no clear end, no clear shift, only gradual deepening into stillness. And sleep followed as part of the same ongoing rhythm that had carried everything before it. Nothing broke, nothing separated, nothing changed its outline. Everything remained within the quiet center of repetition, and the days continued, softly, steadily, and without end.
Morning arrived again, though the word arrived no longer felt accurate. There was no arrival anymore, only continuation, a gentle unfolding of light that seemed to have no clear beginning, as if it had already been there long before it was noticed. The room remained unchanged in every soft detail, the same corners, the same shadows, the same quiet air resting evenly across everything. The child woke without any sense of transition. No boundary marked the change from sleep to wakefulness, only a slow, seamless awareness of being present again. Not new, not different, just ongoing. The home carried its familiar stillness, not as something maintained, but as something that no longer required maintenance. Everything seemed to know where it belonged without being reminded. Breakfast unfolded with the same gentle precision as always. Small movements, soft silence, a steady rhythm that required no attention to sustain. Outside, the world offered no strong contrast, no sharp edges of light or sound. Everything existed in a balanced, muted state that did not invite closer inspection. The walk to school happened without awareness of travel. There was no sense of movement through space, only passage through something already known so well it no longer felt external. Inside the classroom, stillness had become the natural condition of everything, not imposed, not maintained, simply present like air itself. Lessons continued in their quiet, unbroken flow. No part stood apart from another, each moment blending gently into the next. The children responded in quiet coordination, not as individuals reacting separately, but as participants in a shared rhythm that had formed over long repetition. And repetition, once fully absorbed, no longer feels like repetition at all. It becomes structure. It becomes normality. It becomes the shape of time itself. Outside, life continued in its steady pattern. Work, routine, order. Not as separate categories of experience, but as variations of the same ongoing motion. There was comfort in that motion, a deep, quiet comfort that came from knowing what everything would become before it happened, from never needing to question direction, from never needing to anticipate change. But within that comfort, something continued to soften further, not in a way that could be seen, only in the way things were felt. Differences between moments grew more subtle, less distinct, less meaningful. One day no longer stood clearly apart from another. One experience no longer carried strong separation from the next. Everything began to merge into a single continuous impression of time. By midday, light rested evenly across all things. Nothing brighter, nothing darker. Just a steady presence that did not change in noticeable ways. Afternoon passed with its usual calm flow. Tasks followed tasks, moments followed moments. Nothing interrupted the sequence long enough to define it. Even thought itself moved within narrow, familiar paths, not restricted, but naturally contained by what it had already become accustomed to. The walk home felt identical to every previous walk, not remembered as familiar, but experienced as the only way it could be. At home, everything remained in place without effort. The structure of daily life no longer felt built, it simply felt existing. Even silence no longer contrasted with sound. It was simply the environment in which everything took place. There were still faint traces of something slightly different at times, a passing impression, a thought without shape, a feeling without direction. But these did not develop. They did not persist. They passed through awareness and dissolved into the steady continuity of the day. Not pushed away, not examined, just not held. Evening arrived gently as always, light fading into soft stillness without interruption, the world settling into its familiar tone. Inside, everything felt complete, not through change, but through consistency, through continuation without break. And in that continuation, completeness no longer required awareness, it simply existed. Night came without distinction, no end, no shift, no separation from what came before, and sleep followed as a natural extension of the same ongoing rhythm. Nothing stood apart, nothing broke the flow, nothing changed its shape. Everything remained within the quiet continuity that had slowly become life itself, and the days continued, softly, steadily, and without end.
Morning came again, but it did not feel like morning. It felt like a continuation of something that had never paused long enough to be named. Light spread through the room in its usual quiet way, touching the same surfaces, resting in the same corners, as if it had already learned every detail of the space and no longer needed to look. There was no contrast, no beginning, only presence. The child woke without recognizing the moment of waking. There was no shift between states, no awareness of change, only the soft, ongoing condition of being here. Breath moved without attention. Stillness softened into motion. The day continued without announcement. The home remained exactly as it had been, not in a frozen way, but in a way that no longer allowed distinction between before and after. Everything felt continuously placed, continuously correct, continuously unchanged in any meaningful sense. Breakfast unfolded in its familiar sequence. No part stood out more than another. No action felt separate from the next. Everything moved in a calm, unbroken line of repetition. Outside, the world held its steady tone. The sky did not feel new. The air did not feel different. Everything existed in a kind of quiet uniformity that no longer invited observation. The walk to school passed without awareness of movement. There was no sense of distance traveled, only the soft experience of continuing through something already known too well to notice. Inside the classroom, stillness had become indistinguishable from reality itself. Not silence, not quiet, just the normal state of everything. Lessons continued in their steady, unmarked flow. Nothing rose above the rest. Nothing required emphasis. Everything unfolded evenly, like a single long breath that never fully ended. The children responded without thought of response, not through effort, not through hesitation, but through a pattern that had become embedded too deeply to separate from action. And what is embedded deeply enough no longer feels learned. It feels natural. It feels inevitable. Outside the classroom, life continued in its familiar structure. Work, routine,
order, not experienced as separate things anymore, but as expressions of the same continuous rhythm. There was comfort in this rhythm, a comfort that came from the absence of disruption, from the absence of uncertainty, from the absence of anything that might require new understanding. But over time, even the idea of new began to lose its meaning, because nothing stood apart long enough to be recognized as different. Everything began to feel like variations of the same moment, slight shifts within the same steady surface. By midday, light filled the space in a way that no longer suggested time. It simply existed, without change, without progression, without direction. Afternoon unfolded in its usual way. Tasks completed themselves through habit. Time moved, but without being noticed as movement. Even thought became quieter still, not absent, but no longer reaching outward, no longer forming contrast, no longer seeking difference. The walk home was identical in every subtle way, not remembered as familiar, but experienced as simply what always is. At home, everything continued without interruption. Nothing required correction. Nothing required attention. Everything remained aligned with its quiet structure. Even silence had lost its identity as silence. It was no longer something that surrounded life. It was what life was made of. There were still faint impressions of something slightly beyond it all, a thought without shape, a feeling without direction, a moment that almost became awareness. But these impressions never formed fully. They passed through gently and dissolved, not resisted, not pursued, just unheld long enough to fade. Evening arrived without distinction, light fading softly, without marking the end of anything. The world gently continuing into stillness. Inside, everything felt complete, not because anything had been achieved, but because nothing had been separated. Nothing had broken the flow. And in the absence of separation, continuity becomes indistinguishable from existence itself. Night came without change, no boundary between one state and another, no clear turning point, only gradual deepening into quiet. And sleep followed as part of the same unbroken rhythm that had carried everything before it. Nothing stood apart anymore. Nothing interrupted the flow of time. Nothing asked to be noticed. Everything remained within the soft continuity that had become the shape of life itself. And the days continued, quietly, steadily, and without end.
Morning returned again, though even the idea of return felt unnecessary now. There was no sense that anything had gone away, only a soft continuation of light, already present before it was noticed, already filling the room before awareness arrived to recognize it. Everything felt gently ongoing, without start, without end. The child woke in the same seamless way as always. There was no moment of separation from sleep, no clear boundary where one state ended and another began. Only the quiet awareness of still being here, still within the same steady existence. The home held its familiar stillness, not because it had been arranged recently, but because nothing had disturbed it enough to make it feel otherwise. It remained as it always was, not through effort, but through uninterrupted repetition. Breakfast unfolded without variation. The same movements, the same timing, the same silence between actions. Nothing emphasized, nothing distinguished, everything simply continuing. Outside, the world offered no strong impression. The sky held its even tone. The air moved gently without direction. Everything felt softly neutral, as if resisting the idea of change.
The walk to school passed without awareness of passage. There was no feeling of travel, only movement that felt already completed even as it occurred. Inside the classroom, stillness had become indistinguishable from existence itself. Not a condition, not a state, just how things were. Lessons continued in their steady, unmarked rhythm. No emphasis, no interruption, no distinction between one moment and the next, only continuity expressed through repetition. The children responded without hesitation or reflection, not because they were instructed in that instant, but because instruction had already become part of how they existed. And what becomes existence no longer feels separate from self. It simply is. Outside the classroom, life followed its familiar structure: work, routine, order, not as separate parts of life, but as expressions of the same continuous pattern. There was comfort in this continuity, a comfort that came from the absence of disruption, from never needing to adjust, from never needing to question. But over time, even comfort began to lose contrast. It no longer stood out as comfort. It simply became the baseline of experience. Everything began to feel evenly shaped, without peaks, without edges, without clear separation between moments. By midday, light rested across everything in the same soft manner. Nothing felt brighter or more present than anything else. Everything shared the same quiet tone. Afternoon unfolded without emphasis. Tasks followed tasks. Time passed without recognition. Even thought itself moved less and less in distinct directions. It no longer branched outward. It remained close, quiet, and contained. The walk home was identical in every subtle way, not remembered as familiar, but experienced as the only way it could ever be. At home, everything continued without interruption. No adjustment, no correction, no need for attention. Everything remained within its quiet structure. Even silence no longer had boundaries. It was not something between sounds. It was the condition in which everything existed. There were still faint impressions at times, a thought without shape, a feeling without direction, a moment that almost became awareness. But these never developed. They passed through gently and dissolved without trace. Not resisted, not explored, just not held. Evening arrived without definition, light fading in the same soft way it always had. No clear sense of ending, only gradual quieting. Inside, everything felt complete, not because anything had been achieved, but because nothing had ever been interrupted. And in uninterrupted existence, completeness no longer requires awareness. It simply exists as the condition of everything. Night came without distinction, no shift in feeling, no separation from what came before, only continuation into stillness. And sleep followed naturally, as part of the same ongoing rhythm that had always been there. Nothing stood apart, nothing changed, nothing interrupted the flow. Everything remained within the quiet continuity that had become life itself. And the days continued, softly, steadily, and without end.
Morning came again, but it no longer carried the feeling of arrival. It simply was there, a gentle brightness resting across the room in the same way it always had, without beginning, without effort, without change in its quiet presence. Nothing in the room responded to it. Nothing needed to. The child woke without awareness of waking. There was no sense of transition, no boundary between rest and awareness, only continuity, smooth and unbroken, like something that had never paused long enough to be divided into parts. The home remained in its steady condition, not maintained, not adjusted, just continuing in the same familiar shape that no longer felt shaped at all,
It felt natural, as if it had always been exactly this way. Breakfast unfolded in its usual calm sequence, no variation, no emphasis, no distinction between one action and the next. Everything moved in quiet alignment. Outside, the world appeared soft and uniform. The sky neither invited attention nor resisted it. The air moved gently, without direction. Everything existed in a kind of balanced stillness that no longer suggested change. The walk to school happened without awareness of movement. There was no sense of distance or progression, only the continuation of being within the same familiar pattern. Inside the classroom, stillness had become indistinguishable from life itself, not a quality of the space, but its default state. Lessons continued in their steady, unmarked rhythm. Nothing rose above anything else. Nothing required emphasis or memory. Everything unfolded evenly, like a long, quiet current. The children responded without hesitation or reflection, not through conscious decision, but through patterns already absorbed too deeply to separate from action. And what is fully absorbed no longer feels learned. It feels inherent. Outside the classroom, life continued in its quiet structure. Work, routine, order, not as separate experiences, but as different expressions of the same continuous flow. There was comfort in that flow, a comfort that came from never needing to interpret change, from never needing to compare moments, from never needing to define anything as different from anything else. But over time, even that comfort began to soften into background, not disappearing, just no longer standing out in awareness. Everything began to feel evenly shaped, without contrast, without distinction, without edges that could be clearly noticed. By midday, light filled everything in the same quiet way it always had. No variation in meaning, no shift in presence, just steady continuation. Afternoon moved forward without interruption. Tasks followed tasks. Time passed without being recognized as passing. Even thought itself had become quieter, less branching, less questioning, less reaching beyond what was immediately present. The walk home felt identical in every subtle way, not remembered as familiar, but experienced as simply the only possible form of movement. At home, everything remained aligned without effort, no correction needed, no adjustment required, everything continuing in its established quiet order. Even silence no longer felt like silence. It had become the environment itself, not noticed, not separated, just there. There were still faint impressions sometimes, a thought without shape, a feeling without direction, a moment that almost became something different. But these impressions never expanded. They passed through gently and dissolved into the ongoing stillness. Not resisted, not followed, just not held. Evening arrived without distinction, light fading slowly, evenly, without marking the end of anything. The world gently softening into its familiar tone. Inside, everything felt complete, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had ever needed to change. And in the absence of change, continuity becomes indistinguishable from existence itself. Night came without separation, no boundary between one state and another, only quiet continuation into stillness. And sleep followed as part of the same uninterrupted rhythm that had always been present. Nothing stood apart anymore. Nothing interrupted the flow. Nothing required awareness to continue. Everything remained within the soft continuity that had become the shape of life itself. And the days continued, quietly, steadily, and without end. Morning arrived again, but it did not feel like morning in any meaningful way. There was no sense of arrival, no sense of shift, only a gentle unfolding of light that seemed to have been there already, waiting quietly, without beginning or intention. The room remained exactly as it had always been, not remembered as the same, but experienced as simply unchanged in a way that no longer required noticing. The child woke without awareness of waking. No transition marked the change from sleep to being awake. Only continuity, smooth and unbroken, like a long breath that never fully ends. The home held its familiar stillness, not as something observed, but as something assumed. Everything in its place, not through effort, but through repetition so complete it no longer felt like repetition at all. Breakfast unfolded in its quiet sequence, the same motions, the same timing, the same soft silence between actions. Nothing stood out enough to be remembered separately. Outside, the world remained in its gentle uniformity. The sky neither brightened nor darkened in a way that felt significant. The air moved without direction or urgency. Everything existed in a soft, even state that no longer suggested contrast. The walk to school passed without recognition of movement. There was no sense of traveling through space, only the feeling of continuing within something already known too completely to question. Inside the classroom, stillness was no longer noticeable as stillness. It had become the condition in which everything naturally occurred. Lessons continued in their steady, unmarked flow. No emphasis, no interruption, no distinction strong enough to divide one moment from the next. The children responded in quiet coordination, not through thought, but through alignment formed long before awareness could intervene. And alignment, once fully established, no longer feels like behavior. It feels like nature. Outside the classroom, life continued in its familiar pattern: work, routine, order. Not separate things, but different expressions of the same continuous motion. There was comfort in this motion, a comfort that required no awareness to sustain, a comfort that came from never needing to question direction or difference. But even comfort, when constant, begins to fade into the background of perception. Not gone, just no longer noticeable as comfort at all. Everything began to feel evenly spaced, evenly weighted, evenly present. By midday, light rested across everything in the same soft way it always had. Nothing appeared more distinct than anything else. Everything shared the same quiet tone of existence. Afternoon passed without interruption. Tasks followed tasks. Time moved forward without drawing attention to itself. Even thought itself had grown quieter still, less movement outward, less variation, more containment within what was already known. The walk home felt identical in every subtle way, not remembered as familiar, but experienced as simply the only way things ever are. At home, everything continued without effort. No correction needed, no adjustment required. Everything remaining within its established pattern. Even silence no longer suggested absence. It was simply the form in which everything existed, unmarked, unseparated, unquestioned. There were still faint impressions at times, a thought without structure, a feeling without direction, a moment that almost became something else. But these impressions never developed. They passed gently through awareness and dissolved into the same continuous stillness. Not resisted, not followed, just not held. Evening arrived without definition, light fading slowly, evenly, without signaling an ending.
the world softening into its familiar quiet state. Inside, everything felt complete, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had ever needed to be different. And in the absence of difference, continuity becomes indistinguishable from existence itself. Night came without separation, no boundary between one moment and the next, only gradual settling into stillness, and sleep followed as part of the same ongoing rhythm that had carried everything before it. Nothing stood apart, nothing broke the flow, nothing required awareness to continue. Everything remained within the soft continuity that had become life itself. And the days continued, quietly, steadily, and without end.
Morning returned again, but even the idea of return felt distant now. There was only the soft presence of light, already filling the room before it could be noticed, already resting in familiar places without needing to choose where to go. Nothing felt new. Nothing felt repeated, only continuous. The child woke in the same quiet way as before, without awareness of change. There was no moment that marked waking, no clear separation between sleep and being awake, only the steady awareness of still being here within the same unbroken flow. The home remained unchanged in a way that no longer invited thought, not because it never shifted, but because every shift, every small variation, blended so gently into routine that it no longer registered as change at all. Breakfast unfolded in its usual silence, the same rhythm of small actions, the same soft spacing between movements, nothing emphasized enough to become memory on its own. Outside, the world carried its familiar softness. The sky did not feel different from the day before. The air did not feel altered. Everything existed in a quiet sameness that no longer suggested comparison. The walk to school passed without awareness of movement. There was no sense of distance traveled, only continuation through a space that felt already known beyond recognition. Inside the classroom, stillness had become indistinguishable from reality itself, not observed, not noticed, just present in everything without distinction. Lessons continued in their slow, even flow. No moment rose above another. No part separated itself as important. Everything moved forward as a single, continuous current. The children responded without reflection, not through decision, but through patterns so deeply embedded that awareness was no longer needed to follow them. And what is followed without awareness no longer feels like following. It feels like being. Outside the classroom, life continued in its familiar structure: work, routine, order. Not as separate elements, but as different expressions of the same steady rhythm. There was comfort in this rhythm, a comfort that came from never needing to interpret anything differently, from never needing to compare one moment to another, from never needing to question what was changing. But over time, even the idea of change began to lose clarity, not because nothing changed, but because changes no longer stood apart long enough to be noticed. Everything began to feel gently uniform, without contrast, without edges, without separation strong enough to be recognized. By midday, light rested across everything in its familiar evenness. Nothing appeared more present than anything else. Everything shared the same quiet tone. Afternoon passed without interruption. Tasks followed tasks. Time moved forward without being perceived as movement. Even thought itself had grown stiller, less branching outward, less forming distinction, more remaining within what was already known.
the walk home was identical in every subtle way, not remembered as familiar, but experienced as simply how things are, always have been, and always will be. At home, everything continued without effort, no correction needed, no attention required, everything held in place by repetition alone. Even silence no longer felt like absence. It was simply the medium through which everything existed, unbroken, unquestioned, unmarked. There were still faint impressions at times, a thought without form, a feeling without direction, a moment that almost became something else. But these impressions never held shape. They passed through awareness and dissolved into the same continuous stillness that surrounded everything. Not resisted, not examined, just not held. Evening arrived without distinction, light fading evenly without signaling an end, the world softening into its familiar calm state. Inside, everything felt complete, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had ever been separate enough to require change. And in the absence of separation, continuity becomes indistinguishable from existence itself. Night came without boundary, no clear transition, only gradual settling into quiet, and sleep followed as part of the same ongoing rhythm that had always been present. Nothing stood apart, nothing interrupted the flow, nothing asked to be noticed. Everything remained within the soft continuity that had become life itself. And the days continued, quietly, steadily, and without end.
Morning arrived again, as it always had, but something about it felt even softer than before. Not different, just quieter in how it existed. The light spread across the room without hurry, without intention, touching everything in the same familiar way it had touched it 1,000 times before. And yet even that number felt unimportant now, because nothing was being counted anymore. Not truly. The child woke, though even the word woke felt unnecessary. There was no clear moment of beginning, only the continuation of awareness, as if it had never stopped and never would. Breath moved, stillness followed, and life simply remained where it had always been. The home was the same, not because it resisted change, but because change no longer felt like something separate enough to notice. Everything had blended into a quiet, steady familiarity that no longer asked to be observed. It simply was. Breakfast happened in its usual way. Small movements, soft silence, a rhythm so familiar it no longer needed attention to continue. Nothing felt important in isolation. Everything felt gently connected, part of the same soft flow. Outside, the world remained calm. The sky did not demand meaning. The air did not ask for recognition. Everything existed in a quiet balance that no longer tried to become anything more than what it was. The walk that once felt like movement now felt like continuation. There was no sense of going anywhere anymore, only passing through what was already known too completely to feel separate. Inside the classroom, stillness had long since stopped being noticeable. It was not silence anymore, not order, not routine. It was simply the way things existed when nothing needed to be changed. Lessons continued, though even the idea of lesson had softened. There was no urgency, no emphasis, only gentle unfolding of moments that did not compete with one another. The children responded, but even response had become quiet, not thoughtless, not forced, just natural, like water finding its level without effort. And over time, even time itself stopped feeling divided. There was no sharp line between before and after, only one long, continuous presence that carried everything without interruption. Outside the classroom, life continued in its familiar rhythm: work, routine, order. Not as structure imposed on life, but as life itself, moving in its most familiar shape. There was comfort in this shape, a comfort that no longer needed to be noticed to exist, a comfort that had become indistinguishable from existence. And so even comfort faded into the background. Not gone, just no longer separate enough to be recognized. By midday, light rested evenly across everything, as it always did. Nothing stood out, nothing called attention. Everything simply existed together in quiet balance. Afternoon passed gently. Tasks followed without interruption. Time moved without being marked. Even movement felt like stillness expressed in another form. Thought, too, had become soft, not absent, but no longer reaching for anything beyond what was already present. The walk home was the same as every other walk, not remembered, not anticipated, just lived as continuation. At home, everything remained in place without needing care, not because it was maintained, but because nothing ever broke the pattern anymore. Even silence no longer felt like something surrounding life. It was what life had become. And in that silence, there were no longer strong impressions of difference, no sharp contrasts, no clear divisions, only gentle sameness stretching across everything. Even the faint moments that once tried to become thoughts, or feelings, or questions, no longer held shape long enough to matter. They passed through, softly, and disappeared. Evening arrived without announcement. The light faded.